Hey, deserving listeners, last resort, 90 Day Fiancé. Let's check it out.
Talk about how Angela
We're gonna
defended
talk
me,
about
and you got called out for not supporting your fiancé.
Yeah, I said earlier that I need to manage my expectations so it's not more bothersome. I don't know why. I just always believe. I think another part of it is that I'm not there. I've seen much worse in my office. I've seen some really atrocious behavior. I mean, not typically, but you practice for 20. At one point, I always knew how many. So since '96, I was an intern. I started then, and so 27 years. 27 years. Okay, 27. Prime number. So for 27 years, when if you've been practicing for 27 years, then you're going to see a lot of different kinds of things. And I was also kind of wondering the other day that I will talk about specialties that I have or I've had. And I was wondering if some of y'all are like, how many specialties does Kirk have? Because, during the Johnny Depp Amber Heard trial, I was provoked to talk a lot about my experiences working with court-mandated perpetrators of intimate partner violence. I was also provoked to talk about my experience with borderline clients, which is a very significant specialty of mine throughout my career, from the very beginning until today. My intimate partner violence work, perpetrator work, was intense, but hasn't been necessarily. I've come across a lot of abusive individuals, but the court mandated, the people who were convicted and sentenced to my therapy group was kind of a particular chapter, and other kinds of specialties. And sometimes I wonder if people are thinking, how is that possible? Especially some clinicians, because the trend now is I hear this from a lot of novice clinicians, and I've been hearing this for, 15 years or something, where it's very important that when you graduate from graduate school and you become a therapist, you have to specialize. You have to specialize. You have to advertise yourself. I'm the couples guy, or I'm the borderline girl, or I'm the transgender focused therapist, or I am the social justice focused therapist, or I am the anxiety focused. And if that works for you, that works for you. But I've always disliked that approach for myself. If someone else wants to do it, great. And often the advice is given, like, if you want to be successful as a clinician, particularly in private practice, you have to create a brand, right? And I never did that, because I don't know if anyone ever told me to do that. Plus, I didn't want to limit myself. There were so many things I wanted to do, and also, you just never know what the market is going to do for you. It's sort of like with doing this right now. When I started this podcast, so let me just go on this tangent for a second. Sorry. When I started this podcast, I did not want most other podcasts of all sorts, whether it's comedy or history or psychology, the format will tend to be the same every single episode. And for me, the YouTube channel and podcast, Psychology Style is one big thing. And if you just look at the categories of content that we provide, whether it's an episode, a deep dive with Umberto, whether it's me watching reality TV, or I'm doing a deep dive by myself on a personality disorder, or I'm talking with Bob or Rebecca, or I'm interviewing someone, or we're doing a live show that's kind of silly, or we're talking about Star Wars, or I'm reacting to Will Smith or Ruby Frankie, or if I told someone when I started this podcast that I wanted to do all those things, they'd be like, "That's not going to work, because your brand is all over the place." Because no one's going to trust that. They're going to think it'll dilute the brand or something, And plus, when people give the elevator speech of what you do, it'll be too hard to explain, and thus you won't gain longevity. And so I've just never been that way. It's the same with music. People would tell me that with my songwriting, people would say that I was all over the board. I didn't have a genre. I mean, it's pretty clear that I'm in the sort of alt rock genre. So, but within that, there's if you listen to 99% of bands, there's a consistency between the songs. And for me, I don't know. I can't do that. Not that I I'm such a genius that I've tried to do that, and I physically can't do that for some reason. So whether it's my band or whether it's this podcast or whether it's my practice, I've always wanted to do what I wanted to do. I didn't want to limit. Why would I want to put a fence around my own? If I lived on 1,000 acres, why would I put a fence that was just a quarter of an acre? And I would never leave that. Like, it doesn't make any sense to me. I want to see the world. So with my specialties, it's been similar. And also, I never know what I'm going to be asked to do. I've talked about this before, where I've had, for a time in the beginning of my career, people saw me as the Asian adoptee specialist because I was a family therapist. I don't do family therapy anymore. I'm still a family therapist, but I haven't had a family session in a long time, probably like 10 years-ish or something. But I've mainly just been an individual adult and couple therapist for 10, 15 years-ish, 15. Anyway, but at the beginning of my career, I did that as well, but I also worked with families, and you work with teenagers. And since I was a guy, I would get a lot of teenage boys. And since I'm Asian, I would get a lot of teenage Asian boys. And some of the most struggling families in any community will have teenagers who were adopted post 12 months because they were either abused while they were in a facility up until they were adopted, or the attachment disruptions were so great that the child has conditions that make it so that it's really hard for them to regulate their emotions and care about other people, including their adoptive parents, meaning that when their adoptive parents are like, please stop running away, please go to school, and the kid's just like, screw you, I don't want to. And, anger and resentment, the whole thing. But I would get a lot of those families, and I became a specialist in that because of people just referring them to me. I guess I was probably the only young, and mind you, I'm also like barely not a teenager at the time. I'm 26 years old, 27 years old. And people thought I was a teenager. People thought I was a teenager till I was like 39 or so. I mean, no joke. So if I had limited myself, I wouldn't have taken that client, or I would have been advertising myself in whatever narrow focus I had, that those families would be like, well, he does that other thing, so I can't bring my... And when you're in private practice, it's all about marketing and getting clients, because especially in the beginning, you just, because clients are constantly dropping off. You need customers to come in the door. And of course, you don't trick people into therapy, but you need a lot of people calling you so you can pay your bills. That was a big concern of mine. I had a hard time paying my bills in the beginning of my career because I was in debt from school, and it was hard. So I was happy that in my book, I was happy that I didn't limit myself. Anyway, so why am I talking about that? This happens occasionally, where I tangent upon tangent, and then maybe that's a whole other thing. Even in that paragraph, or no, it's not a chapter of the past 10 minutes of me talking, I didn't want to limit myself. You can't limit me. You can't put shackles on this YouTuber. Let's just rewind 5 seconds. Maybe it'll remind me.
I can't act like that. Didn't we just have we're going to start from the beginning.
I want to talk about how Angela
We're going to
defended
talk
me,
about...
and you got called out for not supporting your fiancé.
That's kind of...
I don't remember why I got to where I got, but I did want to say that he's launching right back into this. And yeah, of course, we've seen it before. The self-assuredness that he has. Liz isn't helping, but she's certainly being a lot more reasonable than he is. And she certainly has a lot more justification based on the edit to just complain. But if I were a little birdie on his shoulder, I would say, okay, if you just want to blast him, go for it. Maybe he deserves it. But if you actually want to work it out with him, then you might want to be a little bit more diplomatic and, put your phone down and look to him and say, So let me tell you this is what I always do. It doesn't always work. This is what I do in my personal life. This is what I recommend that people do in therapy, is to walk through your experience, because what she's doing is she's sort of like, she's jabbing at him, and maybe he deserves it, but it's not likely to work, particularly with him, right? So what do I mean by explaining experience? Liz could say, so we were getting in the hot tub and you took off your clothes, and yeah, it was silly, and it wasn't, in my mind, a huge problem. That's Liz thinking it. To me, it was a huge problem. It was a huge risk and potentially traumatizing to other people without consent. But anyway, for her, it doesn't seem like that's what she's focusing on. But you're being silly, and I laughed, and it was fine. But it did remind me of other times when you will really, in a pretty rigid, pointed way, go after me about me wearing revealing clothes, or that one time when I had a nip slip or something and it was a complete accident and you wouldn't let it go for like a week. You just took your clothes off, and just because you're a man, somehow that's okay. And I don't know, it just sort of reminded me of all those times. And and to tell you the truth, I didn't like it that you were exposing yourself to everyone, because we're in a relationship, and that's just, we didn't talk about that would be okay to do. It's not a huge crime, but I just want to say, it was bothersome. So maybe we could talk about that's a little bit more diplomatic, right? And I still don't think that he would respond well, but at least it would give him a little bit more of a chance. But I understand where she's coming from. She's probably been, who knows what goes on behind the scenes. They could have a perfect relationship behind the scenes. We just wouldn't know. But if the edit has anything to do with reality, then I can't imagine, because she's been with him for years, I can't imagine how many arguments that they have had. And they've reported, right? Because they've broken up 30 plus times or something, literally. The last time we checked in them. So it's probably been 90 times since in their entirety of the relationship. And can you imagine how many times she's just gone round and round with him about this? And so, I would understand she's just like, I'm just going to blast him and screw it.
For her to call me a bitch and I didn't say or do anything, and you standing there like a little bitch, she needs to stay in her own relationship. I sat there very quiet while you and Kelly were just going back at each other because you cheated in the game, and then you got all defensive saying, stop calling me a cheater. You called him a bitch. You both said things to each other. You can't.
No, but
Okay. Ed is semi-listening. He's not over-talking. He's defending. So the 4 horsemen of the apocalypse, according to John Gottman and colleagues here in Seattle, University of Washington, that the team found was the precursor to divorce or breaking up or dissolution or major dissatisfaction in a relationship are defensiveness, stonewalling, resentment, and criticism. So defensiveness, if there's one thing you can do in your relationships, particularly in situations like this, and I guarantee you, if you are in a long-term relationship or have been, you've been in conversations like this. If there's one thing that you can try to be self-aware about, is defensiveness. Defensiveness, defensiveness, defensiveness. It is the bane of relationships. If I could snap my fingers, right, with the Infinity Gauntlet and stop all defensiveness from ever happening again, I'm guessing that divorce rates would plummet. And he's it. So I'm going to rewind this and just watch how he responds. It'll be a defensive statement. Now, your defense and your statement might be rational, might be logical, might be fair, but generally speaking, in these conversations, if the goal is to try to get to a resolution, if you're always defending, then it's not likely to work out well. At best, you will agree to disagree and start to resent each other. At worst, it just escalates, because when someone's trying to explain themselves, even if they're doing a bad job, and all you're doing is like grabbing the one thing out of 10 things that they said and you're refuting it, then it's very frustrating to the person who is talking, because they're saying a lot of things, and maybe they're not saying it in a good way, but it depends, right? So if someone's really coming after you, then all bets are off. But in the general milieu of conflict, a very common pattern is that, I'll be watching a couple discuss, and the Liz person will be doing their best to communicate, and the only response that the other person will have is some sort of defensive statement. Let's rewind.
You and Kelly were just going back at each other because you cheated in the game, and then you got all defensive saying, stop calling me a cheater. You called him a bitch.
So there's 1,000 different things that Ed could say. There's 1,000 defensive things. There's 1,000 non-defensive things. He could say nothing. That's not defensive. He could say, oh, what happened? That's not defensive. Or, oh, that's not what I remember, but maybe I'm wrong. Or I'm sorry. What did I tell me more? Or I'm sorry that that happened, that I did that, or I don't know. I'm in that zone. Another thing that he could say would be, even it's not even necessarily defensive to say that's not how I remember it, but what do I know, right? It's not defensive. You're still saying some refutation, if that's a word. But so there's a lot of different things to say, but Ed will, and we heard the beginning of what he says here.
Both said things to each other. You can't.
No, but he's the one that came at me saying,
what? I really don't.
Right. So everything that she said, there were 10 things that she said, and he picks one thing. No, he came after me. Okay. But what about the other things that I said? What about that you were over talking? What about, all that other stuff?
You're always talking. No, Liz, I know you don't care. You don't listen, and you're never wrong. And Liz, for the first time in my life, I've never, and I don't approve of her behavior or the way that she did it. I've never had anyone stand up for me like she did.
Go.
Okay, so he does. I don't know if I've seen this pattern. Maybe I did. He'll give a bone. He'll have some consolation, and you'll get your hopes up, and then it'll all come crashing down. So he says, I don't, and they edited that. I think he might have even elaborated in a healthy way beyond that a little bit. But he said, at least, I don't know, but he says, I don't approve of her behavior. And you're like, oh. And then he's like, but I've never had anyone stand up for me. Stand up for what? If anyone, she should have been yelling at Kelly. Where was Angela when Kelly was doing all that stuff? But when it comes to Liz, somehow even just a tiny little bit of pushback, and she just wanted to go to bed, So, yeah. So then she says what she says, and I think she walks off soon, which I think is her only way of dealing with this.
Be with her. You're not letting me speak, so I'm done talking.
But listen, when you get mad, you raise your voice.
You don't let me speak. I am running away from.
And then, I don't know if you noticed it, but she says, I don't care, because she's trying to get something out, and she's not being heard. So she's trying to over talk or something. And she says, I don't care. And he says, I know you don't care. And I think that might have been misinterpreted by him, or interpreted accurately, who knows, but I think that triggered him, and then he started going on the attack, and then she says, I'm done, I'm going to walk away. Then he starts to go into his narrative that she's a child because she raises her voice and she walked away. That keeps him in a superior place. It's a safer place for him. The metaphor that just popped in my head is that this superior mindset is this tiny little buoy in the middle of a stormy ocean for these people. It's not a very good, stable ground to be on, but it's the only available flotation device that will help you to survive. And for these individuals, and I don't know if he's one of them, but if they don't have that buoy, then they have nothing. And if you've ever been around someone with these kinds of characterological issues and that buoy is not available to them, that superiority mindset isn't available to them, they will crumble I don't quote me on this, but I believe that L. Ron Hubbard, Scientology, it's been speculated that he had narcissistic personality disorder, and there were reports of him not having that buoy. He had the buoy a lot because he was constantly getting narcissistic supply and literally starting a religion and a cult, and eventually got a lot of people to love him, and so that helped him. But there were moments when that wasn't available to him, and don't quote me on this, but I seem to remember there was a report of him crying in his office for 3 days straight or something. So it's a desperate behavior. It's not just like, I'm going to be superior today. It's their only lifeline. And it doesn't make it okay. And it doesn't mean that you have to stick around these people. I will remind everyone that when I provide a compassionate, but what I think of as an accurate perspective of these individuals. And, when I describe these individuals, it's my language and my flavor, but it's not necessarily my concept. The things that I talk about with personality and character and development of personality, it goes back to the Freudian days. The stuff that Freud and his people said, a lot of things, or a lot of figures, Ferenczi, Abraham, Klein, just so many different figures from back then. And the things that I'm saying are integrated with, those things are integrated into the way I talk about it. So I'm not unique in that way. It's not a huge mystery, the things that I'm saying. But anyway, so I'm not saying that so when I say accurate, I'm not saying I'm accurate. I'm saying this model is accurate. And a lot of people find that to be accurate. It's not necessarily psychodynamic. It's just based on schema and on learning and on conditioning and on trauma and on attachment. It's integrating a lot of different brain science. Anyway, the point is that when I provide what some of you would call compassionate or wholesome, I would call accurate perspective of these individuals, I'm not saying that you have to stay with them if you're in a relationship. Just because I'm not labeling them as a toxic person doesn't mean that you have to live with them. When I come across people like I'm not saying like Ed, because we don't necessarily know if we know Ed, but when I come across people who have narcissistic personality disorder, who are on the spectrum, depending on the situation, depending on their recovery, how much therapy they've been in all likelihood, I will figure out a way to get away from that person, because unless they're a client, then I absolutely will invite them and work with them and enjoy working with them. But, it's different professionally. In my personal life, generally speaking, I will conspire privately to distance myself from that individual and hopefully get that person out of my life completely, because I feel bad for them, but it's not my job, and I didn't damage them, so it's not my fault. And I have one life to live, and I'm not going to live it in terror and bother and codependency of their problem. So I just want to remind everyone of that, because sometimes I always figure that's implied, but it's not. And so I'm happy to reiterate that.
Run away, run.
Ed, you never let me talk.
Where's my coffee?
So this is interesting too, because we see her having a real raw emotional moment, and then you see him say, "Where's my coffee?" Okay. So what's happening for him, underneath that bravado and that superiority and that indifference is that. And it could even be much worse than that, because at least she is letting it out and also potentially signaling to others to get support, and they will support her, I don't know about now, but at different times of her life. For Ed, I wouldn't be surprised if he has never gone there and signaled and asked for support, because he either is too afraid or he doesn't even think he needs it or something, and certainly doesn't want to subdue himself to someone else, that kind of thing. So it's tempting to believe that Ed is not a 9 out of 10 on the distress scale right now, and that she is, but she might be like a 7 and he might be a 10. Okay, well, let's adjourn there. And everyone, please take care of yourself because you deserve it. You really, really do.